Well, a couple more questions before we wrap up and play a couple songs. This was sent in to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Daniel in Nottingham, United Kingdom. How did Fritz Von Erich...
As a matter of fact, while I was over there, I met the sheriff.
Sheriff of Nottingham.
Sheriff of Nottingham. He was a hell of a guy.
All right, Friar Tuck. How did Fritz Von Erich transition from a hated Nazi heel gimmick to having the biggest territory in Texas? Did it break kayfabe back then when he didn't speak with a German accent?
Well, the answer to that is that was before my time, and I'm not sure exactly how they pulled it off otherwise than when Fritz went originally. Fritz Von Erich was a huge star, especially up in the Northeast and the Buffalo and Toronto area, but all across the country in the 1950s. He was bigger than most guys were back then. He had that rough voice. He had that fucking look with the crew cut, and he had those big fucking mitts. His hands were huge. That's why the claw was kind of come up with, and it became something that a lot of German wrestlers did, but he had those big fucking hands. But he'd been a star football player at Southern Methodist University. So in, the early 60s, or mid 60s at best, he decides he's going to get off the road. His oldest son, Jackie, had already been electrocuted in that trailer park that they were living in up in the Buffalo territory. And he decided he was going to get off the road, take his wife, Doris, and his sons, and they were going to move back to Texas. And he was actually going to move to Corpus Christi and open up like a fishing and boating and bait thing or whatever the fuck and raise his family. And he stopped off in Dallas to take some bookings, and it ended up getting over so fucking strong that he never left and ended up buying into the local office there from, just say the fucking promoter's name and Ed
McLemore.
Ed McLemore. Thank you very much. So he ended up not only getting over as the top guy, but then buying into the office and then eventually owning the whole thing. So it was an accident to begin with. And when he first came in as Fritz Von Erich, I'm pretty sure that he was a heel. A Dallas historian would be able to tell us better, but people knew that was a little more than 10 years after he'd been a big time SMU football player. And so they kind of knew anyway. And then they just, I'm sure they probably did a heel versus heel program, maybe something with him and Bull Curry or Johnny Valentine or whatever. And slowly, like, Austin, the people started getting behind him. He kept the name Fritz Von Erich. And just all of a sudden, he didn't do the Nazi thing. He didn't do anything German. He just called himself Fritz Von Erich, but he talked normally and became the toughest man in the state of Texas in the eyes of the wrestling fans.
His sons were the All-American boys.
Yes, and there was as much truth to that as there was to him being a Nazi. But no, I like the boys. I don't have anything against them. I like Kevin. I like Kevin's sons, but everybody knows that they were not exactly, they were all American, but they weren't exactly squeaky clean. They weren't like drinking the milk, like the picture of Kerry and Michael Hayes. Hayes has the Southern Comfort and Kerry's got the jug of milk. Kerry would have probably been in the Southern Comfort too. But that's how it happened. And over a period of time, people accept it and then they forget about it. If it's presented in the right way, and basically the guy has to get over one way or the other. He's got to get over as a badass, and then you've got to have another, the same way that I became a babyface, for fuck's sake, and managing the Midnight Express, because a new prick came along that was as much of a prick as I was, if not more of a prick, but I was the familiar prick. I was the hometown prick. He was the out-of-town prick, Paul Heyman, Paul E. So even if you've got a heel, if he's from the area or if he's been there a long time and the people are familiar with him and they believe in him as being a tough guy, then if you get the right heel to bring in and put against him, you can switch him without actually doing an angle to begin with. You get the people naturally over to that guy. That's what Dusty did with us and the Horsemen, which nobody ever switched Babyface when the Midnight Express had a rivalry with the Four Horsemen. It was just, these guys are all dirty. They're all going to cheat. Oh my gosh, it's going to be wild. But then there has to be a sympathetic figure. So that's the way you lead it. And then the sympathetic figure becomes the hometown fucking hero. So that was all back in the 60s. None of the TV exists. I don't know how it was done step by step, but that was the general progression of the thing.
I think Fritz turned babyface before his big match with Gene Kiniski. So that would be 66 or 67 he turned face, probably.
Because the world champion is coming in. We've never had a world title change in Texas. We've never had the local, because, well, at that time, Dory had not even been champion. Had there been a champion from Texas? There had never been a world champion from Texas at that point in time. And that's why Fritz and Kiniski in 67, Fritz and Dory in 72 drew 26,000 people to the outdoor ballpark there, did they not, in Dallas?
Texas Stadium.
Was
it not Texas Stadium?
No, wait a minute. The Dory match may have been Texas Stadium, but the Kiniski match was before they opened Texas Stadium, but it was still so big they needed to go to a ballpark. Is that not what it was? And there was what was it, Turnpike Stadium or something like that in the 60s? And I don't know. Point is,
you know what? I have the program right here, actually. I just grabbed it.
Well, of course you do.
June 24th, 1972. It is Texas Stadium, Fritz versus Dory Funk Jr.
Okay, I thought you meant the Kiniski program. I think the outdoor match with Kiniski was in a different place, I believe. But the point is that Fritz was able, a lot of people think that Dallas didn't take off until the Von Erich Sun started and they got the national television syndication. It had been bad for a couple of years. The late 70s were not a good time period for the Dallas territory, and it wasn't a big money territory, and that's when Houston took over as being the place where the guys on Friday nights in Houston made as much money for their payoff as they made the rest of the fucking week in the rest of the Texas territory, including Dallas and Fort Worth, because Fritz was getting older, and the people had seen him, and he was on the tail end of his career, and they never kept a lot of talent in the territory. 12 guys, maybe 14 guys, tops, half and half baby faces, half heels. And I've got Fritz's 1977 booking book that I acquired that has the gates. And you're looking at the Dallas Sportatorium doing $4,200, right? And some of those. And it wasn't a big talent territory. Houston had because Paul Bosch could do his own thing. Houston took off, but the rest of the territory was not hot. But in the 60s and early 70s, when Fritz was the man and still in his prime, and the people still believed he was going to be the world champion, when he got an NWA title match, he could put it in the big building or even Texas Stadium and draw 20-something thousand people because they believed in him and they were watching the television. And then they took a downturn, and that's when he fed the boys in and started getting them over. And then the whole thing blew up in 82, 83.
You know, and it's interesting, too, about Houston becoming the big money town, because after Fritz took over from Eddie McElmore, he also took the booking office. It went from the Houston booking office to the Dallas booking office.
That's right. They used to book all the Texas talent, except for the Amarillo territory, which the Funks had, control over. All the talent in Texas, the San Antonio territory, or what would become the San Antonio territory, with Joe Blanchard as the local promoter, Dallas, Houston, they all used the same talent. And then when Fritz took Dallas over, like you said, the booking office went to Dallas, and he was booking all the talent, and that's when things started going sideways, because after his run was over, but he wouldn't really retire, but the people knew he was never going to win the title by that point because he was getting too old and it just wasn't happening. So their houses started going down. That's when Joe Blanchard in the late 70s struck out and started his own territory. That's when Paul Bosch started being even more independent and bringing his own talent in and augmenting it with Texas talent. And then, if the boys hadn't come along, Fritz would have lost control of the whole state because it was going downhill until they got over. But the one constant was Amarillo was so isolated. And anybody who has ever driven from Dallas through Amarillo and out into New Mexico can testify. The Amarillo West Texas territory was probably the most geographically isolated of any wrestling territory in the country in the 50s and 60s. And guys in major territories, if they, because Dory Funk Sr. had so much pull and so much respect, and he had trained Eddie Graham or helped train Eddie Graham and had so much pull with the NWA that he could get names to come in and work for him. But it would be a situation where, like, if you were working in a major territory and you were a star and they did an angle where you broke your leg, you go to Amarillo because nobody knew what the fuck was going on in Amarillo in that territory. There was no crossover of television. It was just out there. And unless somebody took a vacation and watched somebody else's TV, they didn't know what the fuck was going on in the outside wrestling world. So Dory Funk Jr. was the toughest man in Texas, the toughest man or Dory Funk Sr., toughest man in wrestling. His two sons, the same thing. They were destined to be world champions from the time he started them and groomed them. Dory started in 63, and I think Terry in 65. The Sheik would come in because he and Dory Sr. were tight. The Sheik, the hottest heel in the business, would come in and work long programs and could be there half the week out in Amarillo, but the people in Detroit and nowhere else in the country wouldn't know anything about it. And it just happened that way because I have a program with Dory Funk Sr. on the cover from December 1948, which was his first week in the West Texas territory. This is a town in New Mexico. And I even fooled Terry Funk because he said, yeah, we can't. Dad came to Amarillo in 49. I said, no, he was there in 48 Christmas week. I've got a program. He said, oh, son of a gun, Corny. I didn't know that. But if Dory Funk Sr. had not gone to Amarillo and started the whole Boys Ranch thing that later on Eddie Graham spent time learning from him and took the Boys Ranch thing to Florida, not only would Dory and Terry have never been world champions because Senior would have never gotten that pull, but the whole face of wrestling would have changed with the people that Dory Sr. either influenced or trained or gave a shot to, even in Baba in the 70s, right? Sent Jumbo and sent Tenryu and sent all of his young Japanese guys that he really wanted to push to West Texas to learn how to work from the Funks and their crew. So that little isolated territory was so fucking important to the entire state of the wrestling business for 25 fucking years.
Here's the card for June 24th, 72, Texas Stadium. 8 p.m., I guess because of the hot Texas summer. You couldn't do it during the day like the Parade of Champions. And this is
oh, God, that was miserable too, boy. That was miserable. And that was in May, and it was still miserable.
Dory Funk Jr., world champion versus Fritz Von Erich, 2 out of 3 falls. For the midget world title, Lord Littlebrook defends against Cowboy Lang, 1 fall, 1 hour time limit.
I guarantee you they didn't go an hour.
For the Texas title, Red Bastien defends against Crusher Stasiak, and that's Stan Stasiak.
Yeah.
For the American Championship, The Spoiler defends against Billy Red Lyons. Special event, The Alaskan versus Mil Mascaras. Special event.
Well, wait a minute. Let me jump in there. The Parade of Champions obviously has to have a lot of titles on the line. That's why even the midget title, because Littlebrook had a belt, actually. He had a nice little belt, and Littlebrook booked the midgets. Mascaras was there for the Hispanic audience because he was the top lucha star in the world at that point, top box office attraction. So they would bring him in to the big shows in Texas to draw the Hispanic audience. Go ahead.
Special event, George Scott versus Tommy Siegler.
George Scott at that point was the booker, was he not? Because that's before
before Mid-Atlantic, yeah.
Yeah, he didn't go to Mid-Atlantic until 74. So he was the booker at that point. So he's on the card, and he was a former, big-time wrestling star.
Here's the match I would want to see. The only tag team match apparently on the show. Team match, El Santo and Jose Lothario versus Terry Funk and Mr. Fuji.
What a Funk and Fuji. Santo, of course, they got Mascaras. The Santo's the other one. And even though that was the downhill slide of his career for age at that point. And Jose Lothario, especially in Houston and in South Texas, but he was huge in Dallas also. Lothario was a Texas fucking legend. So you had basically you could draw from two different audiences at that point. You could draw from the lucha audience, that the Hispanic audience that wanted to see their heroes, and the fucking good old Texas Cowboys that wanted to see their heroes.
And then the final match listed here, I don't know how this went, an 8-man, $2,000 Russian roulette. Joe Blanchard, Pedro Godoy, Apache Gringo, Gory Guerrero, Dean Ho, Frank Monty, Mike Padusis, and Bearcat Wright to a finish.
Wow.
Was that a battle royal, or what was an 8-man roulette?
A battle royal, $2,000 prize. Yeah, I think they used to call them Russian roulette battle royals down in Texas at that point in time. It would have gone the way Bearcat Wright wanted it to go if he didn't want to fucking go over the top rope. But I have a feeling he probably wanted to get out of that clusterfuck as quickly as possible.
This was actually Bearcat Wright's return to Texas for the first time in 2 years. He had been a star there a few years before this.
And then he may have been winning it.
And then here's the lineup, or here are the matches for the next week. Which show would you have preferred? Monday night in Fort Worth, the main event, Valentine. I don't know why he's not on this show. Valentine and the Spoiler versus Bearcat and Bastine. Plus Monty versus Mascaras, Godoy versus Lyons, Lothario versus Siegler, the Alaskan versus Ho, and regular prices. And then the next night, Tuesday at the Sportatorium, main event, Johnny Valentine versus Red Bastine, with Godoy versus Mascaras, Padusis versus Siegler, Ho and Lothario versus the Alaskan and Monty, also regular prices. Tickets, $1.50 and up.
Boy, Valentine and Red Bastine. Red Bastine was one of the best babyface workers in the business at one time, and at that time. So that probably would have been a corker. And you see also George Scott using Johnny Valentine heavily on top. That's the first person he called when he got the spot in the Carolinas to come in, was Johnny Valentine, to kick the whole thing off and change from a tag team territory to nationally known singles, from the local guys that were over in that region to nationally known names. He brought Johnny Valentine in to kick the whole thing off, and Wahoo McDaniel, who was huge at that point in time in Texas also. We were down one time it was a WCW event, because Wahoo was an agent by that point, when Turner Broadcasting had taken over, but we were in, oh God, I think it was either Midland or Odessa, Texas. And Wahoo brought a newspaper in that some fan had brought up and showed him when he played football out there, high school football. He made the fucking paper for scoring, 72 touchdowns or whatever he did. He just dominated everything. But there was a little small article right below the article talking about this great, Ed McDaniel, our great high school football star at Midland fucking high school or wherever we went. There was a little fucking ad down, concert, country music, so-and-so, and Elvis Presley. And he said, look, I've been on top longer than Elvis. It was like from 1955 or whatever. But yeah, those guys were an integral part of George Scott's whole fucking philosophy. So a lot of those names, nobody today will remember, and a number of those names they shouldn't. But some of those guys were an integral part of that territory and drew a ton of money back then.